Turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 5. What an important reminder as we've been studying these 10 commandments. Remember, these are, they're make or break. It's not if you generally keep these things. It's not if you keep 6 out of the 10. You have to perfectly keep all 10 to be holy as God is holy. And since we all fail at that, we need His righteousness applied to us. We need Him to stand in our place. As we think about the law, we come to a pivot in the law. There are 2 sections to the 10 commandments that most people seem to distinguish between. Right? There has been some, I think, misunderstanding. Moses carried down 2 tablets from the mountain. It is unlikely that it was half of the 10 commandments on each one of those tablets. It's more likely that the whole 10 commandments were on each one of those tablets, because when a covenant was struck in those days, just like today, if you have an agreement with the bank, you make multiple copies of it. And that was common in that day. And so the law, that was part of God's covenant. And they had these 2 tablets, each representing the covenant, God's covenant, man's covenant. They put those in the Ark of the covenant, which represented, it was symbolic. It was the pledge of God's presence with His people, a reminder of the covenant that He made with them. Right, this is where they stored that covenant agreement that we call the 10 Commandments. And so that was where they went. They went before them everywhere they went. They took this with them, and this led them. It was a reminder of the pledge that they made with God, that He would be their God, they would be His people, and He would dwell in the midst of them. But as we think of the law, there are really 2 parts of the 10 Commandments. Those first 4 commandments, if you have a Catholic background, some of those commandments are squeezed and it's 3, but the first 4 commandments for most who have Protestant Bibles are all dealing with our relationship with God. To not have any other idols, to keep Him at the very center of our life, to not take His name in vain, to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. All these things have to do with our relationship with Him. And then the next 6 commandments have to do with our relationship with our neighbor. That's why in the Old Testament you have those 2 laws that Jesus draws out that sum up everything: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And as it says in Leviticus, to love your neighbor as yourself. And those 2 commandments sum everything up. And you see that in the 10 commandments. You have those first 4 that deal with loving God, and then these next 4 that deal with loving your neighbor. But God, as He begins this instruction on how we love our neighbor, I think it's very important to realize that He starts at home. Because the home is the greatest test of our holiness. The home is the greatest test of our goodness. The home is the foundation of everything we think and believe and do. And it's interesting because as we think through that, it's tough, because those that we love the most, those in our home that we are the closest to, sometimes they're the ones that get the most guff from us. They're the ones that we treat with the most disrespect. And so God begins this discourse. He begins these laws on how to love your neighbor with that relationship that's most foundational to society, the relationship of the family. And He tells us to honor our father and mother. So look with me in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. As we see the commandment, it says, "Honor your father and mother, as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long, and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." What does this mean? What does it mean to honor your father and mother? Too often we reduce it to simply obey. Obey your father and mother. That's a part of it. That's an important part of honoring your father and mother, but that doesn't encompass everything it means to honor your father and mother. It's so much more than that. It's so much deeper than that. To honor something is to give it due weight for its position. And so to honor our parents is to give them this due weight. When we give weight to something, when we assign it worth, we give it our time and our energy. And so we're told to honor our father and mother. God is saying that here are these relationships, here are these authority figures that I have put in your life. And you need to honor them. You need to respect them. You need to give them the weight that that position deserves. And it's through this honoring of parents that we learn everything else about interacting with life around us. See, this commandment, it makes sense on many levels. There's many moral reasons that it's given. Many moral reasons we should honor our parents. Right? Our parents do a lot for us. Tonight, when we get to St. Louis, we'll see my mom and dad. They're going to be coming in for the Southern Baptist Convention, and I'll see them. And my mom wants a hug when I see her, and I give her one just cause. I mean, she did give birth to me and all. So I guess I owe it to her. But no, seriously. I mean, here are our parents, and they did so much for us. They fed us. They took care of us. And, you know, when I'm at home and my dad wants to watch something on TV, even if it's one of those dumb reality shows that he likes that I just can't stand. Hey, you raised me, you fed me. I'm gonna give you the honor that your position deserves. If there's moral reasons we do it, it's the right thing because our parents have done so much for us. And so the right thing to do is to honor them. And there's also religious reasons to do it. In Ephesians chapter 6 and in Colossians chapter 3, Paul says that honoring our parents is pleasing to the Lord. So by honoring my parents, I am honoring God, I'm pleasing Him. There's also pragmatic reasons. When I honor my parents, it's teaching me so much more than simply honoring my parents. It's teaching me how to live in subjection to authority. Right? One of the reasons that we stress, you can ask Henry, what are the two most important things? And Henry should tell you that it's being sweet and being obedient. That's what we stress, be sweet, be obedient. And the reason we stress that at home, because if he learns how to obey mom and dad, guess what? It's going to be easier for him to obey teachers. It's going to be easier for him to obey policemen. It's going to be easier for him to obey his wife one day, whatever the case may be. Part of the reason God gave this is because that learning from a young age, that structure that God built into the home, God did so that from birth we learn that we have this authority, and ultimately it is our relationship with our parents that teach us how to live under the authority of God. As I learn how to live and trust my parents, if I can trust that my mom and dad loved me, even when the rules they had didn't always make sense to me, but I trusted that they loved me and they wanted the best for me, how much more should I have trusted God, knowing that He loved me perfectly and He knew all that was to be known? But in Exodus and here in Deuteronomy, God even goes further and gives another reason for honoring your parents. He says that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that God is giving you. And all these commandments, they have to be looked at in their context. And here Israel, in the book of Deuteronomy, they're on the precipice of going into the promised land. They're about to go into the promised land. This was the land that God promised them because of His covenant with them. This is a land that He promised them through Abraham. He told Abraham many years before that He was going to give Abraham's descendants this land. And now the Israelites had taken a 400-year detour in Egypt. They'd taken a 40-year detour in the wilderness, and now they're about to go into the promised land. And God says to them, if you obey this command, you will have a long life and things will go well for you in the land. Now, what God is doing here is God is saying that things would go well for them, right? That is, if they hold up their part of the covenant, that God would bless them, God would honor that. This isn't the guarantee of a long life, right? We can't, if somebody dies at a relatively young age, we can't just assume, oh, I guess they didn't honor their parents. I mean, that's or to think that, well, I'll honor my mom and dad, and that way I can be guaranteed a good long life. That's not, this isn't a promise here. This is just a general statement of blessing. That's why God says it may go well with you. But there's an assumption here too. There's an assumption behind this commandment that I feel is often neglected. Because as God tells these children to honor their parents, I think that there's an assumption that the parents are to raise their children right. The parents are to fulfill their end of the responsibility. See, parents have a very important role. Parents have this dual role that is essential. Parents are the child's first teacher. Parents are the child's first schoolmaster. It's in the home that children are taught. It's in the home that children are taught how to think about God. It's in the home that the worldview is formed. It's the way that a child sees mom and dad respond to crisis. It's the way that a child sees mom and dad trust God, that their view of God is shaped. And moms and dads, they cannot neglect this responsibility they have to teach their children the ways of God. That's why in the very next chapter, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, after Moses gives the great theological statement of the book of Deuteronomy, that the Lord God is one, he says that fathers should teach this to their children. When they're rising, when they're laying down, basically all the times of the day, whatever you're doing, fathers, parents, it is your responsibility to be pounding in your children's heads truths about who God is. When I think of Paul tells Timothy, where did Timothy, who was young but wise beyond his years, where did Timothy get his theological education? It's from his mother and from his grandmother. Parents are schoolmasters. Parents are also magistrates. Right? Parents teach their kids how to live in an orderly society. It is not popular anymore to talk about discipline. You watch any so-called child expert, they seem to push away from discipline. They seem to push away from corporal punishment. Part of the reason I think that it's hard to find people who want to be teachers anymore too. Right? Kids are growing up and they're undisciplined because there is no order, there's no structure at home. But it is the parent's responsibility to establish this structure from a very young age. Right? By teaching our children, even through corporal punishment, even through spanking if we have to, what we are doing is we are making clear to young minds that there's a difference between right and wrong, that there is a law, that there is a judge, that there are standards, that there are rules, that there's cause and effect, that there's disobedience and obedience. If parents neglect that, then what they are doing is they are unleashing kids into the world who have no concept of right and wrong and cause and effect. Henry asked me this afternoon while stalling for his nap time. He said, "What are you preaching about tonight, Dad?" Thinking he could butter me up some. I said, "I'm preaching about spanking. Go to bed." He goes, "Ooh." He said, "I don't want you to preach about that." I said, "Go to bed so I don't have to practice that." But when parents neglect this role they have to create order in their home, what they are doing is they're not just affecting their kids. What are they doing? They're hurting society in general. They're hurting all the people around them. They are punishing others. There is this role as parents that I think is assumed here, that children are to honor their parents. And as parents, we are to honor that role God has given us as parents, to treat it with respect and to give it the weight that it's due. If our children are going to respect us, if our children are going to honor us, then we must treat this role of parent in an honorable way. But here's the thing. is a lot of times we feel comfortable with this commandment because we feel it's the kid's commandment. But that's ridiculous. Why? It's not as if God would have 9 adult commandments and then 1 kid commandment and just throw it right in the middle. It's not as if that God said, well, I'm giving them these laws. Let me make sure none of the kids feel left out. So I'm going to throw one in here about honoring parents. This is for all people. This is even for adults. This isn't about how to have a happy family. This isn't about how to have a good home. This is primarily about how to reflect God's character in our lives. That's what the 10 Commandments are about. This is about how to be holy as God is holy. How to picture Him, and just as all these other commandments show us attributes of God, so this one is about displaying God's own character in our lives. Because how we respond to our parents often says a lot about how we will respond to God. This command is to honor, not to obey, but to honor. See, that's where we get things wrong, because obedience is an external thing. I could obey my mom and dad, and the whole while I'm going, this is stupid. I don't know why they told me to do this. I don't want to do this. I don't like to do this. I shouldn't have to do this. I can be fussing. I can be fuming. And I'm obeying them. But in no way am I honoring them. If I really want to honor mom and dad, it's not just about this external conformity. I can make my son obey me, but he has to choose to honor me. Honoring is something that's done in the heart. I like what Augustine says. Augustine says, if anyone fails to honor his parents, is there anyone he will spare? A lot of truth to that. If I can't even honor my own parents, I can't give weight. And so this is God teaching so much more than just how to have a happy family. Think about it. When Jesus wanted to picture desperate wickedness, what did He do? Jesus is around and He's talking, and He wants to tell a story that will scandalize everybody. Does He talk about a murderer? No. What story does Jesus tell to shock people with the wickedness of somebody's heart? There's a young man, and he decided he was done with his dad, and so he went while his dad was still alive, and he asked his dad for his inheritance. How dare he? Jesus' day, that would have been so scandalous. That would have been so offensive. There were certain types of murder people could justify, but to do that is unthinkable. And so Jesus, as He's picturing what wickedness looks like, the way Jesus pictures it is a son dishonoring his father. In honoring our parents, we bring honor to God. But here's the tough thing. This is not a conditional command. It does not say honor your father and mother if they are worthy of honor. It doesn't say that. It'd be nice if it said that. That's how we think. I'm blessed. I have a mom and dad that make it easy for me to honor them, but I realize that's not everybody's experience. It wasn't my mom's experience. My mom's dad, though he was a wonderful grandfather to me, he was about as bad a father as he could have been to her. And I watched as his health declined, and he was so reliant on his children. Some of them said, this is what he deserves. He's been awful to us our whole lives. Why should we help him out now? And I watched my mom, who had no reason to be kind to him other than God said it. And she honored him even when by his life he didn't deserve it. See, not everyone lives in an ideal family environment. Thankfully, the Bible is replete with examples of people who didn't live in ideal family environments. Think of Isaac and Ishmael. Right, here's Abraham, the one that God originally made this promise to. You talk about family dysfunction, my goodness. God says that He's going to give them a child, and so Sarah comes to Abraham and says, I'm not really wanting to be pregnant. Why don't you take my handmaid and have a child with her? And so Abraham has a child with her, and his name's Ishmael. And Then Sarah starts getting jealous, and she goes to Abraham and she says, why don't you go send them into the desert? We can't have anything to do with them anymore. And Abraham does it. I mean, you talk about a scar for your dad to reject you to the point that he just sends you out into the wilderness. Ishmael didn't do anything to Abraham. It was Abraham's sin that Ishmael had to pay for. Then there's Isaac. And Isaac grew up around that dysfunction, and Isaac mirrored it. He has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob and Esau, their moms are at one another, and their mom, she gets in the middle of this fight, and she begins to feud, and Isaac seems to like Esau better, but Rebekah definitely likes Jacob better, and so here mom and dad are turning brother against brother. And the Bible's full of all these horrible examples of family. But God still says, honor your father and mother. There is no if. Sometimes the way we honor our parents may not look like what we think. Again, because we so often have this idea in our minds of where we confuse honor with obey, we think wrong about this. To honor our parents does not necessarily mean to obey our parents. I think one of the best examples of what it looks like to honor a dysfunctional father is Jonathan and Saul. Remember Saul? Saul was the king, and Saul was not a good king. He was not a man after God's own heart, and Saul was paranoid, and Saul was petty. And so Saul had all these rules that he would put in place to try and protect himself. And during one battle, Saul swore a curse that if anybody ate anything before he avenged his enemies, that person should be put to death. Well, Jonathan, he didn't hear what his dad said. And so the other soldiers had to intervene to save Jonathan's life. And that just shows you what kind of a dad Saul is, that Saul says this crazy thing, if anybody eats anything before I avenge myself, they will die. And Jonathan doesn't even hear. He's not willfully disobeying his dad. He just didn't hear. But Saul was going to kill his own son anyway. I mean, that's sort of their relationship in a microcosm. That's a picture of it. And Saul treated David so bad. When David killed Goliath and people started chanting, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. Well, that just sowed the seeds of contempt right there. And Saul didn't want anything to do with David. And Saul, even though David was married to Saul's daughter, Michal, there was just this contempt towards him. There was this hatred towards him to the point where Saul was trying to kill him. David was living as a fugitive in order to escape Saul. And Saul ordered his son Jonathan to kill David. Now here's the problem. God had appointed David the king. Now think about this. In those days, the way you got to be king was through your bloodline. And so David being the king to follow Saul meant that Jonathan would not be the king. And Saul ordered Jonathan to kill David, and David and Jonathan had this special friendship. Jonathan knew he was supposed to honor his father, but what's he going to do? His dad says, you got to go find David and kill him. How can he honor his dad when his dad is telling him to do something that is wrong? Something that's against the will of God. And so Jonathan honored his father by disobeying his father. Now that sounds counterintuitive. But see, if you think about it, what honoring means at its core is I'm trying to help my parents do the right thing. I'm trying to aid them in their following God. Jonathan warned David what his father was up to, and he comes to his father and he said, why would you shed innocent blood by killing David without cause? You see what Jonathan does? Jonathan disobeys his dad, but he honors his dad because he goes to his dad and he tries to help his dad do the right thing. And sometimes As a child, what it means to honor your parent is not the cookie cutter answer. It's not the simplest answer. And it is this commission that we have to help those around us do the right thing. Even as adults. See, this commandment doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't say, thou shalt honor thy father and mother until the point when you reach 18, because at that point, they're on their own. I joke with my dad all the time. I say, man, I bet it was nice the day I turned 18, you just had to stop being a dad and you could go on and do whatever you wanted to do. And he laughs because he knows how not true that is. When your kids turn 18, they think that they're adults, but moms and dads really stay in the picture for all of life. And there's no point where this command ceases to apply. Even after your parents die, you can honor your mom and dad. All the days of our life, we are to honor our father and mother. See, in those days, you got to realize there was no Social Security. Social Security was you move in with your kids. They didn't have these social reforms. They didn't have nursing homes. And so you got to realize that in the context in which this was given, they would not have primarily heard this as something for teenagers and for adolescents and for children. They would have heard this for people of all ages. Honor your father and your mother. And it's important that we all honor our father and mother, because honoring your father and mother means you take responsibility for their care. You care for them differently through different stages of life. One of the ways as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, one of the ways you care for your mom and dad is by being obedient to them so they don't have to stress all the time for you. One of the ways you care for them is by following their rules, by building them up, by submitting to their authority. But then one of the most difficult things happen in life when those roles reverse, and the child has to be the caretaker. And that is a tough thing. And it's something that I see causes conflict, it causes stress, it causes worry, when the child has to assume the responsibility for the parent. But to honor your father and your mother means that you take care of them, whatever is needed. And when Jesus comes and has an encounter with the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 15, the Pharisees try and call Jesus on the fact that he doesn't follow the law. And you remember what Jesus does? Jesus says, oh, you're accusing me of not following the law? Well, you guys have money that you say is set apart for God, and so you can't take care of your parents. And you break the fifth commandment. You do not honor your father and mother. Isn't that what the Bible says to do? And the Pharisees' response was, and they just took off and ran. And Jesus is saying that there is this responsibility that they had to take what God had given them and to care for their parents. It also means you continue to give your parents weight and value in your life, to continue to spend time with them and talk to them and listen to them. Your parents have wisdom, and you listen to them. And maybe your parents have gone on to be with the Lord. Maybe they've passed away. But sometimes it's good to still reflect and think of wisdom that they've given us and things that they've taught us. And what it means to honor your parents is to take those lessons they taught us, those values that they instilled in us, and to live them out. If you go back to the context of Deuteronomy, it was the parents' job to pass on the faith to their children. Why? You think about it in the Old Testament, New Testament, they talk about the fathers. They talk about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And there's this lineage of, through the family, these truths and this reality about God is to be passed down. And the way that they were to be honored was by living out what was being taught. I love it when I get to call and talk to my parents. Sometimes I just need to think through things about how to be a husband or how to be a dad or whatever. And they're such a good resource for wisdom. And I honor them and I value them by saying, I need you. Help me out here. We need to honor our parents. And it's remarkable to me that Jesus himself even submitted to this. Again, Jesus, the perfect man, the one who was blameless, the one who really didn't need his mom and his dad. He submitted to this. In Luke chapter 2, verse 51, it says, he went down with them, that is his parents, and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them. But again, in Jesus' own case, it doesn't always mean he just obeyed his parents or did exactly what they wanted. Because later in Luke chapter 2, his parents go to the temple for a visit, and they go back home, and what's Jesus doing? He's staying and he's having debates. Luke chapter 8, Jesus is preaching, and his mom comes up to him and says, hey, we need to talk. And Jesus says, I'm busy. But, you remember on the cross, Jesus is being crucified. Jesus is being killed. And he looks down at the foot of the cross and he sees his mom. And there is Mary weeping as she's seeing her son exposed, naked, being killed, being laughed at, being tortured. And you remember what Jesus does? He looks at John, his best friend who's standing next to his mom, and he says, son, behold your mother. Mother, behold your son. And even in his death, Jesus so honors his mom that he takes care of her. He makes sure that her needs are going to be met. And because Jesus was a perfect son, it also enabled Jesus to be a perfect Savior. Because Jesus submitted to the will of the Father, even in this thing that we think is so mundane and so commonplace, Jesus honored his father and mother, and thus fulfilled the law and enabled us to have a relationship with God because he offered himself up for us as righteousness for our sinfulness. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, thank you that you did